Chapter 64. It was late at night on Lin 47th Street. The door of the old brush pen shop was pushed open and then quickly closed. The dim lights inside flickered like stars and then went out again. Ning Kei untied the heavy weapon on his back, tore off the cloth cover of the big black umbrella, and took off his wet and heavy outer shirt. He handed it to Sang Sang, who was standing in front of him, and asked casually, "I'm hungry. Is the noodles ready?" Sang Sang handed him the dry towel and nodded happily. "I'll serve it to you." A bowl of hot noodle soup was served. It was still 4 Sichuan peppers, but there were more chopped green onions than usual. The golden and tender fried egg on the noodles was extremely rare. Chopping people was indeed more tiring than hoeing. Ning Kei was wet all over and his stomach was wet. How could he resist the temptation of fried egg noodles with scallions? His eyes lit up. He put down the wet towel and picked up the chopsticks to eat the noodles in big mouthfuls. It was extremely delicious. Seeing that he was eating happily, Sang Sang's tanned face was full of joy. She picked up the slightly wet towel and stood behind him to dry his hair. From time to time, she reminded him that it was too hot and he shouldn't eat too quickly. At this moment, 2 coughs sounded in the dark shop. The big boss of Chang'an City, who had been ignored and seemed to be invisible, finally couldn't help but say, "The noodles are very fragrant." Several hours ago, Chao Xiaoshu had said the same thing when he came to the old brush pen shop. Sang Sang continued to dry Ning Kei's hair, pretending not to see him or hear his words. Ning Kei's reaction was a little different from before. He lowered his head to eat the noodle soup and said vaguely, "Give him a bowl." After a while, the second bowl of noodle soup was served. Chao Xiaoshu looked around and found that there was nothing else to sit on except the armchair. But he didn't care. He squatted down beside Ning Kei and took a few bites with his chopsticks, only to find that his noodles seemed to be different from Ning Kei's. The standard 4 Sichuan peppers, 30 chopped green onions, but no fried egg. He couldn't help but pick up his chopsticks and gently knock on the edge of Ning Kei's bowl to remind him. Ning Kei glanced at it out of the corner of his eye and almost laughed out loud. He turned to Sang Sang and said, "Don't be too stingy. Fry another egg." Finally, the omelette was ready. Ning Kei and Chao Xiaoshu held large bowls of noodles and ate happily. Sang Sang squatted not far from them and put the clothes and the cloth cover into a copper basin to burn. No one in the shop spoke. After some time, Ning Kei put down the bowl of noodles in his hand and leaned back comfortably. He rubbed his slightly bulging belly and looked at Chao Xiaoshu, who was squatting beside him. He said, "I killed more than 5 people. You can count again. Don't be stingy. I asked Sang Sang to add fried eggs for you." Chapter 65. Chang'an City must be very lively tonight. After a night of fighting, Ning Kei was very tired, but the blood and knives in the rainy night made him a little excited. He imagined what was happening in each of the markets, guessed Chao Xiaoshu's trump card, and speculated where he would go the next day. He tossed and turned, unable to fall asleep. He kicked Sang Sang awake through the thin quilt. They talked about these things for a while, but still couldn't understand. Sang Sang saw that he looked haggard but couldn't fall asleep. She thought for a while, put on an unlined robe, and brought back a jar of liquor. The two sat on opposite sides of the bed and drank. As usual, most of the liquor went into Sang Sang's stomach. Ning Kei couldn't overcome the alcohol after a few sips and finally fell asleep. The next morning, the spring rain that had lingered for several days suddenly stopped. The beautiful sun came out from behind the rain clouds without a greeting and shone on the birds jumping in the treetops. A horse carriage quietly stopped at the door of the old brush pen shop. A young man who looked like a manservant got off the carriage. He pushed open the half-closed wooden door without a greeting and looked at the master and servant who had just woken up. He raised his chin slightly and said coldly, "Let's go." This was probably the person Cao Xiaoshu had said would come to pick him up. Ning Ke looked at the manservant and noticed that the man's eyes and brows were peaceful, but there was a hint of arrogance in them. From the man's flat Adam's apple and his slightly different standing posture, he should be one of the eunuchs in the palace. Last night, Ning Ke knew that Cao Xiaoshu's backer was in the palace. Today, a little eunuch came to pick him up. Naturally, Ning Ke wasn't too surprised. He was just thinking about whether he should give him a red packet, and how big it should be. In his impression of the novels, the emperor was not anxious, but the eunuchs were anxious. It meant that the emperor was easy to provoke, but the eunuchs were not. In the stories, whenever the protagonist met a eunuch, no matter if the eunuch was a steward or a servant, he would choose an opportunity to hand over a few thin banknotes or even a piece of jade. When he read those stories, the biggest question he had was, where did the protagonists get so many pieces of jade? Note, Ning Ke raised his eyebrows and glanced at Sang Sang, asking her if she should prepare something with his eyes. Sang Sang had always been a stingy girl. She was slightly startled and turned her head away, pretending that she did not understand what he meant. Her young master was not a generous person. After thinking for a while, she decided that she might as well pretend to be ignorant and save some money. The little eunuch held his hands behind his back and casually looked around the shop. On the right side of the imperial couch sat a 16 or 17-year-old girl. Her eyes were slightly drooping and she was using her slender fingers to serve tea. Her beautiful face, coupled with her tranquil expression, made her look extremely graceful. Her slightly tanned cheeks, which had been tanned from running on the grasslands, had now returned to fair in less than 10 days. She was the fourth princess of the Tang Empire, Liu. Between the empress and the princess, there was a middle-aged man sitting on the couch. His black hair was casually tied behind his head, and he wore an extremely large robe. His voice was gentle, powerful, and unquestionable. Occasionally, when he said those two words, his voice would jump up like a cloud hitting a mountain, and thunder would ring through the palace. On the ground in front of the couch, there were more than a dozen officials kneeling. Their heads were deeply buried, and their bodies were trembling slightly, looking particularly ashamed and frightened. The prince and the two old ministers who were qualified to sit also looked extremely ugly. The Tang Empire had never paid much attention to secular rules. Even in the daily discussions and interactions between the emperor and his ministers, the ministers often did not need to kneel and kowtow, but only needed to make a deep bow. This was especially so for the current emperor, who was known for his benevolence. Normally, when the emperor and his ministers met in the discussion hall, His Majesty would even wave away the deep bow with a wave of his hand. However, today, the benevolent emperor suddenly burst into a thunderous rage. The ministers of the Tang Empire finally realized that His Majesty did not allow them to kneel usually because he did not like it. When he was unhappy, the discussion hall became terrifying. The middle-aged man on the couch was naturally the emperor of the Tang Empire, the person with the greatest secular power in the Haotian world. He looked at the ministers kneeling on the cold golden bricks in front of him, and his calm but mocking gaze slowly swept across their faces. The governor of the army, the protector general, the Huaihua general, these were all the bigwigs of the military ministry, the minister of the right, the assistant minister of the central department, the old and young masters of the Ministry of Revenue, the governor of the capital, the assistant minister of the Yellow Gate, the two statues in Chang'an, his younger brother sitting in the chair, and those old fellows. How much did they know about this matter? How can a gang take over the river transport business and move grain from the warehouse? You are all high-ranking officials in the imperial court, and a word from the steward of the mansion would make many people tremble in fear. How dare Cao Xiaoshu not listen to you? Are you really a bunch of idiots? Have you never thought of the reason? The emperor of the Tang Empire looked at his ministers as if he was looking at a group of bastards. His right hand touched the back of his head that was faintly aching, and he even had the urge to laugh out loud because of anger and disappointment. He stared at the crowd, slammed the table, and scolded, "You want to know who is the backer of the #1 gang in Chang'an? Now you know, and you know it's me. Don't you think you've become the biggest idiot in the world? The Fish Dragon Gang. The Fish Dragon Gang. You are all well-educated people who are used to seeing the wind and rain, and yet none of you have thought of the 4 words, Fish Dragon Gang? If it wasn't my intention, who in Chang'an would dare to use this name as a gang name? I am very disappointed in you, not because you ignore the law and oppress the people, but because you are stupid. Idiots. You haven't understood such a simple thing after so many years. If you are not idiots, then who are you?" The chaotic fight in Chang'an on a rainy spring night had finally succeeded in forcing Cao Xiaoshu to use his trump card. However, as soon as this trump card was revealed, the wind and rain disappeared without a trace, because this trump card was too powerful. It was so powerful that it could define everyone as an idiot with just one sentence, and then start to settle accounts later. The ministers kneeling in the hall felt so wronged and sad that they didn't know what to say. They silently thought that for so many years, no one had found any connection between the Fish Dragon Gang and the palace. Besides, the emperor was the noble emperor, while the Fish Dragon Gang was just a small carp in the gutter of Chang'an. Their statuses were thousands of miles apart, and they didn't exist in the same world at all. Who would have thought that there was a connection between them? It was like an advisor in the county government went to make things difficult for a small helper in the kitchen, and in the end, the advisor found out that the helper was under the protection of the Minister of Revenue. But the problem was, how could a guy who was under the protection of the Minister of Revenue be a small helper in the county government's kitchen? If Cao Xiaoshu was an old acquaintance that Your Majesty met in the common people, and the two of them had a friendship, then why had he been soaking in the stinky gutter of Jianghu all these years? As long as Your Majesty said the word, wherein the empire couldn't find a 4th or 5th rank official post for him? This was not because the princes and ministers were idiots, it was purely because Your Majesty was playing with us as idiots. Kneeling on the cold golden bricks and sitting restlessly on the chairs, the Tang nobles and ministers were all full of complaints, but no one dared to jump out and argue with the one on the dragon throne at this time. Chapter 67. Xing Chengyu, the Minister of Revenue, had never felt that the golden bricks of the conference hall were so hard. In fact, he rarely knelt except during the Grand Court Conference, let alone for such a long time. He secretly wiped away the cold sweat on his forehead and felt that his spine was on the verge of breaking. In order to find some kind of psychological comfort, he sneaked a glance to the side and saw the dejected faces of the military officials. Sure enough, he felt a lot more comforted. 2 emotions, luck and fear, rose in his heart. The logistics office wanted the land on Lin 47th Street. It seemed to be the main cause of this conflict, but it was just a small prelude. Although I knew about it, I never intervened. However, the military ministry was deeply involved this time. I heard that more than 20 elites of the Yulin Royal Guards were killed on that rainy night, and a psyche master in the see-through state lost his life. How could His Majesty let you off so easily under such circumstances? The mocking and angry words of the middle-aged man on the throne continued to ring out, and finally turned into a sigh of exasperation. I created such a gang back then and acted as the eyes and ears of the people for the empire. It took me a lot of effort to hide it for more than 10 years, but in the end, I was forced into the open by you guys just because of some petty benefits. From then on, I can no longer play the role I want. Is there anything wrong with me calling you idiots? His Majesty sighed, and the officials sighed. At this time, they all knew that the so-called Fish Dragon Gang was a product of His Majesty's whim when he was still the Crown Prince. They all silently thought that it was just his plaything. How could there be so much to say? At this moment, His Majesty's voice became low and cold, and all the mockery disappeared. He stared at the officials and asked sharply, "The question is, are you really just doing it for those petty interests? I know what you want to do, but how can my wife and daughter be chosen by you idiots who are courting death? You stir up trouble in Chang, and in the name of the Empress and the Princess, but you certainly don't know that my Empress has always been very clear about the relationship between the small gang and the palace, and you, was even carried to the Spring Breeze Pavilion by me to play when she was young. At this point in the lecture, the officials in the hall could no longer bear the wave after wave of absurd and cold blows. The legs of the Huaihua general and the Huangmen assistant minister turned soft at the same time. They went from kneeling to sitting up in fear. The emperor looked at the two of them coldly and said, "The duty of the Tang Empire's soldiers is to protect the land and open up new frontiers, not to help gangs fight for territory. What I despise the most is that you didn't even win. In that case, you go to Chongning City and train the soldiers for me. Train them for 3 to 5 years. When you are sure that your soldiers can defeat the gangs in Chang'an City, then come back." Chongning City was located in the southwest of the empire. It was hot in summer and cold in winter. There were many forests and poisonous creatures in the mountains. It had always been regarded as a dangerous place by the Tang Empire's officials. As for defeating the gangs in Chang'an City for 3 to 5 years, everything was said by His Majesty. If he said that you didn't win, then you didn't win. Then how would you come back? With a few words, a big shot of the military ministry was assigned to a miserable place, and it was very likely that he would never be able to return to the central command. It was a harsh punishment. The officials in the hall became more and more frightened. But when the protector heard that his head was still on his neck, he did not hesitate to heavily kowtow twice and repeatedly thanked the emperor. His Majesty was a little tired after scolding them dozens of times today. Looking at these officials who did not dare to talk back, he also felt a little tired. He took a cup of tea from Li Yu and drank 2 sips, then waved his hand to signal. Eunuch Lin flashed out from the side of the imperial couch and slowly opened the bright yellow imperial edict with his skinny hands. He read expressionlessly, "In the 13th year of the Tianqi era, Xing Chengyu, the Minister of Revenue, was ordered to return home to meditate and reflect for 3 months. I will wait for your confession." The so-called defense memorial was just an excuse. His Majesty was giving face to the ministers in the imperial court by letting him take the initiative to resign and return to his hometown. Xing Chengyu kowtowed in response. Thinking that his official career had been cut short because of such a trivial matter because of a gang in Chang'an, his hands that were supporting his body could not help but tremble. As Eunuch Lin read the imperial edict expressionlessly, an assistant minister was imprisoned, and the warehouse of the logistics department of the Ministry of Revenue was cleaned from top to bottom. Several officials of the Chang'an local government were dismissed on the spot, the capital governor was exiled to Tianshui with a gloomy expression, and the assistant minister of the eunuch was handed over to the Department of Justice for trial. The military ministry suffered the heaviest blow. General Xiaofan angrily wrote a letter asking the military ministry to explain to him why his capable subordinate Zhuo'er was murdered by the military ministry. So His Majesty beheaded 7 people in the military ministry to explain to the important general far away at the border, or rather, to Cao Xiaoshu. The prince suddenly felt his heart tighten. Sweat seeped out of his back and instantly soaked his royal robe. He did not know how to respond. He could only lower his head again and beg for forgiveness in a humble manner. "These years, I have rewarded you with many good things. Recently, the palace treasury has been a little tight. You should make some contributions. I will remember your kindness." "I dare not. Is there anything in this world that you dare not do?" The emperor smiled and said, "As a prince, you actually allowed your steward to open a brothel. If it were not for the fact that Mistress Jian and the Empress were close friends in the early years, I don't know how many more years I would have been kept in the dark by you." It was not a sneer. There was no hidden meaning in the words, but the prince felt the invisible pressure suddenly increased. The speed of sweat on his back became faster and faster. He nervously waited for the emperor's next edict, but after waiting for a long time, he did not hear it. He could not help but feel suspicious. The smile on the emperor's face gradually disappeared. He looked at him calmly and said, "This time, I am not willing to punish you heavily. It is not because of anything else, but because the person who watched over the house of red sleeves for your steward said something for you that he is absolutely loyal to me." The prince suddenly realized that after Cao Xiaoshu went to the house of red sleeves that day, the steward had told him about Cui Delu's report. Although he believed that he was loyal to the man on the dragon throne, he did not want his subordinates to say too much. He always felt that it was a little embarrassing. Thinking about it today, it was all thanks to the words of the steward. Since the first year of Tianqi era, the weather in the Tang Empire had been smooth. The court and the people were in harmony. There were only two relatively big cases. One was the imperial astronomer incident, and the other was the recent case, which was called the Spring Breeze Pavilion case. In the Spring Breeze Pavilion case, on the surface, more than a dozen officials were demoted and 7 people in the military ministry were beheaded. But secretly, some key people in key positions were purged in advance. However, because those positions were related to the safety of the imperial palace and had a bad influence, the news was tightly blocked. On that rainy spring night, Deputy General Chao Ning of the Yulin Royal Guards welcomed eunuch Lin in the palace and also welcomed his own death. Chang III, Chang Siwei, Fei VI and Fei Jingwei, who were previously prisoners, directly beheaded them in the rain with the imperial edict written by the emperor. Then they reported that they died suddenly of illness. Also on that rainy spring night, Lu Si, the 5th Lu of the Fish Dragon Gang, rode his horse and spear and killed Chu Ren, the deputy commander of the Valiant Cavalry Battalion, on the playground of the Valiant Cavalry Battalion. He took revenge for being set up 10 years ago and also completed the mission given by the emperor. It was also after this rainy spring night that many people in the upper class of the Tang Empire knew the name of Spring Breeze Pavilion Old Chow. Or it could be said that they began to pay attention to this name. Those people also wanted to know who the masked teenager of the Yueluan kingdom beside him was, but they had no way to ask. Cao Xiaoshu stood by the lake in the imperial garden, quietly looking at the big lake called Leaving Sea. His green robe swayed slightly in the lake wind. When eunuchs and palace maids passed by him, they would humbly step aside to avoid him. Now that people already knew who he was and what kind of future he would have, they did not hide the envy, curiosity and even admiration in their eyes. Cao Xiaoshu seemed to feel nothing. There was no coldness on his face when he killed the people last night, nor the nervousness that a person from Jianghu should have after entering the imperial palace. He looked relaxed and calm. A golden carp jumped up from the Leaving Sea, jumped over the dragon gate that the palace maids weaved with garlands, and then happily fell back into the water. In many people's eyes, Cao Xiaoshu was like a fish jumping into the sea today in Chang'an City. He would be famous and would rise rapidly. But he did not think so. Chapter 68. The biggest turbulence in the Tang Tianqi era was taking place in the Palace of Council. Many officials in various departments were guessing the fate of themselves and their superiors. The lad in the imperial study was looking around excitedly. Cao Xiaoshu, who was standing somewhere in the imperial garden, acted as if he had nothing to do with these things. He stood silently by the shore of the big lake called Lihai, smiling as he watched the colorful carps leap out of the water and over the dragon gate. Then, they happily fell back into the lake, wagging their tails as they begged for food. Occasionally, he would sigh. More than 10 years ago, he was a young scholar who entered the capital city to take the entrance exam to the academy but was brought into Chang'an by the current emperor. More than 10 years later, he was a green-robed wanderer who stood in the Chang'an night after beheading countless people. Standing by the lake, he thought about the past and the road ahead of him. Naturally, he had a different feeling in his heart. He did not feel that the road to success was attractive, but only wanted to return to the old days when he studied hard day and night and focused on Taoism. A soft ring broke the silence by the lake. The beautiful young princess slowly walked over with two palace maids. Li Yu's gaze fell on the middle-aged man's green robe, which had been washed a little white. She smiled and half-squatted, saying softly, "Greetings, Uncle Chow." The fourth princess of the Tang dynasty, Li Yu, was doted on by the emperor and admired by the people. Even when she met the prince, she would only call him uncle. How could she call a man so intimately? "I dare not." Chow Xiaoshu moved sideways to give way, repeatedly saying that he did not dare. His face was full of fear. However, his body moved slightly, and the wind on the lake moved the corner of his green robe. There was no sense of fear at all, only a sense of alienation and vigilance that kept people thousands of miles away from him. Seeing Chow Xiaoshu's reaction, Li Yu's hands on her waist stiffened slightly. The two palace maids behind her turned pale. However, before they could do anything, Li Yu smiled and answered, "Speaking of which, when my father asked the guards to carry me out of the palace to play, I saw you a few times in the gambling house. However, I was too young at that time and gradually forgot that Uncle Chow had carried your niece before. There is no need to treat me like an outsider today. Your Highness's words really frighten me. How could I dare to call myself the princess's elder?" Chow Xiaoshu responded with a smile. The lake water reflected the sunlight and fell on his handsome face. There was no trace of deliberate humility. He was just carefully guarding the status of a monarch and a subject, not daring to take a step forward. Li Yu had repeatedly expressed her goodwill, but Chow Xiaoshu had repeatedly rejected her. The atmosphere by the lake suddenly became a little tense and even depressing. Li Yu quietly looked at the middle-aged man's face and thought of the anger her father had shown since last night. She was more and more certain that this man was extremely important in her father's heart. She waved her hand to stop the old maidservants beside her from whispering and continued with a smile, "I brought back some barbarian guards from the grassland. I heard that someone asked them about something a few days ago. That person's surname is Chen, and he seems to be your brother?" Xiaoshu said, "Chen, ch. He is, I." Hearing this answer, Li Yu smiled. She shifted her gaze to the sea-like surface of the lake and looked at the lotus leaves disturbed by the swimming fish. She asked, "Is that lad useful?" "Your Highness, I did not use him. I only asked him to help me." Chow Xiaoshu answered, "It's working together, not using him." "If it's working together, then he is also your brother?" Li Yu turned her head and asked with her brows slightly furrowed. Chow Xiaoshu thought of the fried egg noodles in the old brush pen shop and Ning Kei's answer. He laughed at himself and said, "Someone seems to see the world colder than I do." He looked at Li Yu's brows and said seriously, "Your Highness, he does not want others to know. So please keep this little secret for him." Li Yu was slightly startled and then said sarcastically, "Does that idiot think he can keep this a secret for a long time? Does he think he can hide his identity forever by wearing a black mask and combing his hair in the style of the Yueluan kingdom?" Chow Xiaoshu answered, "He will be admitted to the academy soon, and he will enter the second floor. At that time, he will naturally not have to worry about being plotted against." Li Yu thought of Liu Qingqian's evaluation of Ning Quebec. She frowned and asked, "Why do you all think so highly of him?" Chow Xiaoshu smiled and said, "Because he is worth it." Thinking of the knife light at the entrance of the northern mountain road, the leaping figure among the flames, and the story beside the bonfire, Li Yu's expression unknowingly softened. However, her voice was still cold and sarcastic. "I gave him a chance, but he refused to take it. I thought he was an oddball who did not care about his future, power, and wealth. I did not expect him to choose such a way to appear in Chang'an City because he thought it was not exciting enough. But no matter what, I brought him to Chang'an City, so he is my man." Li Yu looked at Cao Xiaoshu with a faint smile. Uncle Cao, shouldn't you tell me in advance that you are using my man so cruelly? The confrontation of words was, after all, a psychological contest. Fourth Princess Li Yu was naturally the most outstanding woman in this aspect among the younger generation. However, in front of Spring Breeze Pavilion old Cao, who was used to seeing bloodshed, she did not have the slightest advantage. Having found a good excuse, Ning Ke shouted happily and rushed to the front of the table. Like a good man eating meat and drinking wine, he melted the ink, grabbed the brush and spread the new paper. The itch that had accumulated in his heart for several breaths was all turned into joy, and with one stroke, he wrote 5 ink characters. The flower blooms on the shore. Chapter 69. Lu Ban wielding an axe in front of his door, Du Kong selling wine in front of his shop, and the headmaster of academy drying books in front of his door were, of course, the most overconfident actions. But if one were to look at it from another perspective, when Lu Ban saw the guy wielding an axe in front of his door, Du Kong saw the guy selling wine in front of his shop, and the headmaster of academy saw the guy drying books in front of his door, especially when they realized that the guy was the most sacred and supreme existence in the secular world, would they feel the same itch as Ning Ke from the bottom of their hearts? I want to be a wooden bird and tell that guy that the prototype of an airplane is like this. I want to brew a pot of wine and tell that guy that the wine of a fallen country is like this. I want to write a few words to tell that guy that this is the soul soup. I want to write a few more words to tell that guy what is called writing. Even if you are the human sovereign or the heaven emperor, you have to listen to me. At this moment, Ning Ke was immersed in this extreme pleasure. He looked at the gradually drying ink on the Xianzhou bud paper with satisfaction. He imagined that he was playing the role of His Majesty's calligraphy teacher, using those brush strokes to slap the old man's palm, and scolding him with disdain and disdain. I wrote wrong again. Stretch out your hand and hit the board. He was very satisfied with the 5 words he had written and even felt that they were the best he had written in recent years. Other than the excellent quality of the brush, ink, paper, and inkstone, and the wonderful location of the imperial study, the most important reason was that he had accumulated too much itch in the room. More importantly, the first 5 words were written by the emperor himself. He admired his round brush with relish and the straight and broad structure. For a moment, he was a little reluctant to destroy the paper. So he was ready to put it into his sleeve after the paper was dry and quietly take it out of the palace. However, at this moment, an angry roar suddenly sounded outside the imperial study which had been silent all this time. Where did that bastard go? Ning Ke was shocked. When he looked up, he saw the door of the imperial study being pushed open by a hand. His pupils constricted slightly, and with a quick flick of his finger, the ink paper on the drying table lightly slid into a gap in the corner of the bookshelf. Then, he turned around, folded his sleeves, and pretended to look at the books on the bookshelf. As his sleeves brushed past, the row of books on the bookshelf had already changed directions, and the flowers bloom on the shore was firmly pressed in the innermost area. No one could tell that someone had moved it. The person who walked into the imperial study was a short and strong middle-aged general. He wore a palace bodyguard uniform and had a black gold belt tied around his waist, showing his extremely high rank. The middle-aged general saw Ning Ke beside the bookshelf and the lad who was engrossed in reading like a calligraphy addict. He was so angry that he rolled his eyes and yelled, "Who the hell let you in?" Ning Ke pretended to be absent-minded, but in fact, his ears had been pricking up to listen to the movements behind him. When he heard this, his heart thumped. He guessed that there was some misunderstanding in this matter. It should be that he had misheard something when the little eunuch had told him what to pay attention to. It should not be a conspiracy like the White Tiger Hall. If the palace wanted to deal with a nobody like him, there was no need to do so much. However, the crime of entering the imperial study without an edict could be serious or minor. No matter what, he could not let himself get into such trouble. He was like a cute little scholar who had been dazzled by His Majesty's collection of books. He turned around and rubbed his eyes. He looked at the short and fat bodyguard at the door and said with a face full of confusion, "I have entered the palace by imperial edict. Is there a problem?" The short and fat bodyguard was slightly startled. He had probably never imagined that someone could be so calm and unperturbed after being caught red-handed in the imperial study. He could not help but reveal an inexplicable expression on his face. He painfully covered his forehead with his hand and angrily said to himself, "Old Chow, you bastard. You didn't even teach me the rules in advance." Ning Ke walked out from behind the desk and bowed with his hands folded in front of his chest. He asked in confusion, "General, do you know Brother Chow?" In Lin 47th Street, in Spring Breeze Pavilion, no matter how Chow Xiaoshu had behaved in high spirits, Ning Ke had always refused to acknowledge him as a brother. At this moment, he did not care and naturally said the word brother. It was to protect himself. As for the rhetorical question, it was to turn defense into offense. Anyway, his purpose was to divert the other party's attention from the imperial study to somewhere else. The short and fat bodyguard confirmed that there was no one around the imperial study. He looked at the array in the room with a vigilant and uneasy expression. He did not find anything strange. He covered his forehead again with some lingering fear and looked at Ning Ke in pain. He said, "You rascal, hurry up and come out. I have been looking for you outside for almost an hour. Who would have thought that you would dare to come in here? Remember, you did not come in here today. Don't even think about showing off to others for the rest of your life. Otherwise, I will destroy you." Ning Ke followed the nagging bodyguard out of the imperial study. He took 2 steps to the west and came to the guard duty room in the Spring Harmony Hall not far away. It was also because of those past events that this batch of secret guards now had the treatment that they did not have in the past. He looked at Ning Ke with a gentle smile and said, "Don't worry. You can enter the academy if you can. After you graduate from the academy, you will still be serving the imperial court. There is no conflict between the two." "You haven't told me what I need to do," Ning Ke insisted. "The Fish Dragon Gang has been exposed, but there is no longer any problem with the Jianghu in Chang'an." Su Chongshan frowned slightly and said, "Your task is very simple. It is to collect information. We will talk about the details later." If Jianghu was no longer a problem, then the biggest problem other than the imperial power was the world of cultivators. Thinking of the fact that he was about to enter the academy and the vague instructions of the deputy commander, Ning Ke naturally thought of a possibility. Was the imperial court going to attack the academy? The guard token in his hand was a little wet from his sweat. But he knew that he could not refuse these things. He only hoped that things would go differently from what he imagined. He slowly fiddled with the slightly damp waste token in his palm. After a moment of silence, he said, "According to what you said before, no one should take the initiative to contact me. So how should I report anything to you? I don't think we'll meet again in the palace, right? I never imagined that this kind of thing could be done in such an open and above-board place. Why not?" Su Chongshan said proudly, "There's no safer place in the world than the Tang Imperial Palace." Ning Ke sighed and reluctantly accepted the fact. He then raised his head and looked up expectantly. He said, "I can't let anyone know about the reward of reputation. Then, when can I meet the emperor?" Su Chongshan looked at him blankly and then burst into laughter. He rubbed his round belly and laughed. "You little brat. Do you think that you're entering the palace today to meet the emperor? Isn't that so? How old are you?" 16. What's your surname? Ning. Su Chongshan looked at him and asked seriously, you're not a centenarian and you're not a distant relative of the royal family. Then why are you so thick-skinned? Ning Ke touched his cheeks, which could barely be considered delicate, and shook his head. Su Chongshan sighed and looked at the lad. He shook his head and said, Chang III and the others have not seen His Majesty for many years. Then why do you think that you're qualified to meet the Emperor alone? After a moment of silence, Ning Ke said seriously, my handwriting is really good. If His Majesty likes it, he might be reluctant to let me be a bodyguard and directly summon me to the palace to be a reading attendant or something. Su Chongshan stopped smiling and looked at him mockingly. Other than bodyguards, only eunuchs can stay in the palace all year round. Ning Ke's expression froze and he smiled awkwardly. He did not dare to continue this topic. Su Chongshan was the deputy commander of the Tang Imperial Guards and was naturally very busy. Today, he purposely took some time and even more time to summon this lad alone. This was already giving Cao Xiaoshu a lot of face. After the discussion, he naturally chased Ning Ke away without hesitation and rushed back to the side of the Palace of Council to serve. Ning Ke walked out of the empty guard duty room and was worried about how he would get out of the palace. He wondered if he would end up in a spring willow palace like how he had entered the imperial study by mistake. He wondered if he would meet a cold and resentful woman in the palace and something really f***ed up. Or if he would meet a princess whom he thought was an idiot but still occasionally thought of. Then he saw the little eunuch who had led him into the palace standing beside him like a ghost. Even though he wanted to question the little eunuch for not being clear about what he had told him and causing him to be tempted and frightened by the drugs in the imperial study, he finally kept his mouth shut for safety reasons. He said, 2,000 taels of silver can be covered with a quilt. What will you do when your young master earns 8,000 or 10,000 taels of silver in the future? Spring in Chang'an was very beautiful. Spring rain fell from time to time, giving birth to all the green leaves and tender flowers on the streets and alleys. No matter if you were standing in the doorway or in the pavilion, you could see the colors of life. Lin 47th Street in the eastern city seemed to come alive with the growing spring colors, and gradually became lively. After the Spring Breeze Pavilion incident, the Minister of Revenue was demoted and the entire shipping department was purged. The land requisition that had been bothering for months naturally came to an end. The warehouse of the shipping department on the other side of the wall was dead silent like a big tomb. Although the Fish Dragon gang was forced to step onto the bright stage, they did not forget to clean up the darkness of the whole city. At this time, no one dared to do anything to Cao Xiaoshu's street, not even to look at it. It was originally an excellent location and a quiet place to do business. Now, without the pressure of the government and the deterrence of the underworld, those closed shop doors naturally reopened. Whether it was the new boss who took over or the old boss who bought back the lease at a high price, they all rolled up their sleeves and were ready to take advantage of the warm spring weather to do a good job. Business was a human industry, and what it emphasized was to gather wealth and people. In the past, there was only one shop on Lin 47th Street, and it exuded a sense of decline from the bottom of its bones. Naturally, no one was willing to shop there, and the business was extremely poor. Now that all the shops on the street were open, and it was bustling under the spring trees, people naturally gathered. Compared to the neighboring shops, the old brush pen shop's business was still not very good. But compared to the cold fire and autumn smoke when it first opened, the situation was much better. Sang Sang was very busy every day, but the smile on her little face grew more and more, and she also insisted on not letting the young master hire more helpers. As for Ning Ke, he still had a bit of the rotten aura of a young scholar in his bones. Looking at the bustling scene in front of him and thinking of the cold old days, he increasingly disliked the customers who bought paintings and calligraphy. Now that he had more than 2,000 taels of silver in his hands, he did not care much about the income of the old brush pen shop, so he simply raised the price of the scrolls by a large margin. In his mind, since he was not short of money now, and they were so cheap as to come to his door to buy it, he naturally had to spend more money. Only then would he be worthy of himself, and only then would he be able to vent the resentment from the previous day. However, things always developed beyond his imagination. The price of the old brush pen shop was raised again and again, and finally it was raised to 5 times the price when it first opened, but he did not expect that there would be more and more customers who came to buy paintings. Although the old brush pen shop was still not famous in Chang'an City, it was already a brand in a small area in the eastern city. So this is how it should be played? Holding a small teapot, Ning Ke leaned against the door and looked at the customers in the shop. He happily sipped 2 mouthfuls of tea and listened to the quarrel in the newly opened fake antique shop next to him. He felt that life was really King wonderful. The shop owners on the street did not know that the revival of Lin 47th Street and the abundant profits they could make had something to do with the little boss of the old brush pen shop. They did not know that if Ning Ke had not helped Chao Xiaoshu to kill all the people on that rainy spring night, this street would probably still be as dead as before. Now, in their eyes, the young boss of the old brush pen shop was just a good-for-nothing who did not know how to make money and only knew how to enslave handmaidens. When business was good and money was earned, people would naturally be happy, but it would also easily cause some new problems. Now that business had only been good for 4 or 5 days, the boss of the fake antique shop already had plans to take a concubine. The fierce quarrel today was precisely because of this matter that the boss and his wife were fighting. How dare you think of taking a concubine with your looks? Why can't I? If I say you can't, then you can't. If you push me too hard, I'll complain to the Chang'an local government. Even Her Majesty can't interfere in this matter. Why should the Chang'an local government interfere? Even Ning Ke has a little handmaiden, and you kick me out of bed every day. Why can't I, your master, ask for a foot warmer? You want me to warm your feet? Not even a vermilion bird. Unless Ning Ke becomes the emperor. His surname is not Li. How can he be the emperor? Yueluan Kingdom, South Jin Kingdom, Great River Kingdom, as long as it exists in this world, I can be the emperor of any country. Ning Ke held the teapot and sipped happily, listening to the quarrel in the corner with great interest. He secretly praised the people of the Tang Empire for being so brave and open-minded that they even dared to mention the throne in a quarrel between husband and wife. Suddenly, his expression froze and he realized that he was actually mentioned in the quarrel. He could not help but feel annoyed. Just then, the customers in the shop had left. Sang was tidying up the table. He walked in angrily and shouted, "I can't live like this anymore. The 2 in-laws quarrel and they dare to use me as an excuse. They even dare to discuss politics." The gist of it was that he was here to ask the shop owners not to worry about their business, and if there were any problems, they could ask their subordinates to handle it. Following the middle-aged man's instructions, the 5 or 6 men who had been standing behind him silently cupped their hands in front of their chest. The middle-aged man in a green robe would stop in front of each shop for a while and say a few words. He seemed to be very patient. The subordinates around him also walked slowly with him and gradually walked to the end of the street. At the end of the street, there was a shop selling calligraphy and ink called Old Brush Pen Shop. Next to the window, Ning Ke and Sang looked at the fairyland on earth, and looked at the black and white buildings of the academy above the grassy slope. They could not help but be a little lost in thought. After a long silence, he looked back at Sang and said very seriously, I must enter the academy. Sang Sang raised her little face and looked at him worriedly. She said, "Young master, have you finished the few sets of real questions for the academy entrance exam?" Ning Ke was silent for a long time, and after a long time, he said angrily, "Auspicious words. You little kid don't know what auspicious words are." The officials behind him immediately stared at the instructor of the academy and said, "How can a handmaiden enter the start-of-term ceremony?" The middle-aged instructor of the academy did not seem to feel the anger of the officials at all and replied indifferently, "There is no restriction for handmaidens to enter the academy. This is a ceremony, not an examination. Just don't let her in later." Being rebutted by the instructor, the official could not get angry. After all, no matter how high his status was and how much power he had, it was useless in a place like the academy. The prince laughed at himself and patted on Ning Ke's shoulder. Without saying anything more, he led the officials to move forward. Ning Ke gently bumped Chu Yuxian with his shoulder and looked at the instructor beside Li Peiyan. He whispered and praised, "Xian, this is what it means to be neither bland nor salty. I like the academy more and more." The bell rang for the second time and it was the last time. The instructor of the academy told them the rules of the examination room expressionlessly. But the students were too nervous to remember because the rules of the academy entrance examination were so loose that they were not forbidden to chat or ask questions, but they were not allowed to tell each other the answers. Stepping on the scattered peach petals on the flagstones, the students in long robes walked up the stairs and entered the classrooms to prepare for the examination. Sang Sang was left standing alone on the stone ground outside. At this moment, a few drops of spring rain fell. She looked up and squinted at the rain. Then she opened the big black umbrella on her back. The content of the academy entrance examination was similar to that of the imperial examinations of the Tang Empire. There were 6 subjects in total: etiquette, music, archery, driving, calligraphy, and mathematics. The total score was calculated and the students were admitted. In the morning of the academy entrance examination, there were 3 subjects, namely etiquette, calligraphy, and mathematics. The first one was mathematics, which the Tangs were not good at or were not interested in. It was quiet in the exam hall. The window frames on the wall framed the white walls and pink plum blossoms outside. It was like a peaceful and beautiful pastel painting, creating an environment that was very suitable for the mind to move. However, after receiving the mathematics test papers, the students who were sitting in front of their desks suddenly fell into chaos and sighed in a low voice. How can it be a comprehensive question? Some students pulled their hair in pain. Are we so unlucky? Some students looked pale. Because there was no rule against making noise in the examination room, the students could not help but express their dissatisfaction and sorrow in various ways. In previous years, mathematics was the most difficult question in the academy entrance examination. Chapter 77. In reality, lightning was white. Occasionally, there would be purple, but never black. Today, on the lawn outside the academy, everyone saw a black bolt of lightning. The examinees looked at the black horse that was as swift as an arrow, leaping out of the herd of horses in an instant, galloping forward at a terrifying speed that no one could catch up to. They thought of the disheveled examinees who had been thrown off by the horse's hooves, and thought of the red-clothed young lady who had tears on her face as she stood outside the fence, and couldn't help but be shocked speechless. Their eyes subconsciously followed the black lightning and saw Ning Kai, who was sitting on the back of the big black horse, bowing slightly like a falling leaf. They could not understand what this young candidate had done to the naughty black horse to make it so obedient and show such amazing strength. The meadow outside the academy was vast, covering an area of many acres. However, the examination area surrounded by fences was not very large. Everyone was still in shock. It seemed that the girl in red had just raised her right hand to cover her open mouth in surprise when the driving test abruptly ended. To be more precise, the black horse had reached the finish line ahead of the rest of the examinees by nearly half the time with an incredible speed. Ning Kai jumped off the horse's back and wiped off a few drops of sweat on his forehead. He turned around and patted the big black horse's thick neck with satisfaction, and then heavily patted its thick buttocks. He waved his hand and left. When the big black horse saw that Ning Kai signaled it to leave, it suddenly felt that it had escaped from the horrible blood swamp and returned to the happy human world. It neighed happily and rubbed against Ning Kai's shoulder to please him. Then, it hurriedly kicked its hooves and left, not daring to look back. It seemed to be even faster than during the exam. The candidates at the entrance of the fence looked at Ning Kai in silence, as if they were looking at a monster. Many people wanted to ask him how he did it, but did not dare to ask because of the strangeness he had shown earlier. Ning Kai felt the strange gazes from all around and frowned slightly. He slightly lowered his eyes without looking sideways, and walked directly to the academy entrance exam area. It was not his original intention to attract the attention of the surrounding examinees and even the instructors. Showing off his talent for vanity was also not in line with his ideas. However, he knew that his results in the 3 subjects were a mess. If he did not perform well in the last 2 subjects, he would definitely not be able to pass the entrance exam. He had prepared for years, spent so much money, abandoned his military status, and rushed thousands of miles from the grassland to Chang'an. But in the end, he could not enter the academy. It was really a sad D minor serenade. Ning Kai did not know that this noble lady of Chang'an was Situilan, the daughter of Yunhui General. He stared at her with great boredom, turned around and squeezed out of the crowd with Sangsang's little hand. The girl in the arrow robe turned around in surprise and shouted at his back, "Don't you want to see the results?" Ning Kai did not look back and calmly said, "A+." The girl in the arrow robe and the people around her heard this and were so shocked that they almost fell to the ground. They thought, where did this guy come from? How could he be so confident and arrogant that he knew he would get A+ without even looking at the results? Sang raised her little face and gave him a puzzled look. Ning Kai looked at her and explained with a smile, "They are not as good as me at pretending to be deep and cool." Chapter 78. Ning Kai squeezed out of the crowd with Sang, but did not leave. He stood at a corner of the academy's stone ground and watched the lively scene by the screen wall. He felt a little remorseful and felt that it was meaningless to deliberately act like that before. He did not know whether it was the big black horse or the arrows that made him feel as if he had returned to the grassland or the Shubi Lake, subconsciously feeling a little nervous. In fact, he did not know whether he could pass the exam or not, so he was very nervous. Today's academy entrance examination gathered many young talents from all over the world. If it were not for the black lightning in the driving exam, Ning Kai, who was dressed in ordinary clothes, would not have attracted much attention. At this time, he was far away from the crowd, so naturally no one cared about him. The examinees' attention was still on their own scores and those who were already quite famous before the academy entrance examination. For example, Wang Ying from Linchuan, who was personally sent back by the instructors of the academy from a remote village. Although he was only 14 years old, his etiquette and literature had caused a sensation in Chang'an a few days ago. Another example was Zhong Dajuan, a gifted scholar from a famous school in Yangguan. However, Wang Ying was still young, and Zhong Dajuan's fame in the southern Tang was due to his poetry. Therefore, most examinees favored the third son of the Xia family from Ruyang in the South Jin Kingdom. The Xia family of the South Jin Kingdom was a 1,000-year-old family, which was famous for its poetry. The third son, Xia Chengyun, was intelligent since childhood. He could write at the age of 3 and write poems at the age of 5. During his growth, he made friends with many famous scholars. The elders in the Xia family appreciated his talent and spared no expense to invite talents from all over the world. Thus, he became famous today. Xia Chengyun was only 18 years old this year, but he was already the Tanhua of the South Jin Kingdom's imperial examination. After the imperial examination, he insisted on quitting his official position in the South Jin Kingdom and traveled thousands of miles north to the Tang Empire in order to enter the academy. Although the academy's enrollment was strict, it would be too unbelievable if the Tanhua of the South Jin Kingdom could not enter. Therefore, no one doubted whether Xia Chengyun could pass the exam, but only cared about whether he could get the first place. At this time, Xia Chengyun, Zhong Dajuan, and Linchuan Wangying were standing under the screen wall, looking up at the list with their hands behind their backs. Zhong Dajuan, dressed in a black robe, showed an indifferent expression on his face. He knew that his result in the second course of driving and archery could only be average, and it was impossible for him to win the first place. Who could have thought that before the praises stopped, a guy who got 3 A's, appeared like this? Who is Ning Ke? Who is Ning Ke? The candidates who had not seen the scene of the black lightning anxiously asked their companions around them. The candidates who had seen the scene began to talk about the legendary scene of the big black horse changing from a fierce wife to a well-behaved servant with relish. Situilan was looking around for Ning Ke and found him standing in the distance. She hurriedly took Jin Wuxia's hand and pushed the crowd to run over there. Xia Chengyun and the other two seemed to be forgotten at this time. He laughed at himself with a touch of indifference flashing in his eyes. He reached out to invite Zhong Dajuan and Wang Ying to go with those noble ladies of Chang'an. The candidates under the screen wall automatically separated to make a path, like a tide, and then gathered together. They followed them to the corner of the stone platform, to the candidate called Ning Ke whom they had never heard before. Ning Ke did not know what happened at the screen wall. He was lowering his head to discuss with Sang Sang what to eat in the shop at night. Suddenly he found a commotion in the crowd, and then the girl in the arrow robe rushed in front of him. Situilan stared at him and asked, 3 A's, you, how did you get the A's? Ning Ke was startled. Looking at the growing crowd in front of him, he replied, I reviewed very carefully. Sang Sang looked up at him with her willow-like eyes full of confusion. She thought, young master, do you know what reviewing is? Those who can't answer such an idiotic question are even worse than idiots. Then, the grading can only be based on speed. When I was grading the paper, the cinnabar hadn't even melted yet, and he already answered, so he got an A+. Student, please let me pass. An old woman in a blue cloth gown, holding a bamboo broom in her hand, appeared at a corner of the stone ground. She stooped and slowly swept away the dust under the feet of the crowd. Then she slowly walked out. Looking at the back of the old woman disappearing into the depths of the academy, the examinees were stunned and speechless. In fact, at least 4 out of 5 examinees could not answer this math exam, but the old woman said that it was a question that even an idiot could answer. Someone could not help but say angrily, who does she think she is? A teacher in charge outside the crowd coldly replied, "She is the only female honorary professor in the academy. Those among you who are admitted to the academy will be in her hands for the next few years in the math exam." "Is she, the second professor?" Ning Ke looked at the stooped old woman in the distance, trying hard not to laugh in his heart. Xie Qingyun, the third young master of the Xie family in the South Jin Kingdom, had completely calmed down. Although he was young and aggressive, he was still the first in the overall score of the academy entrance exam. Moreover, his goal and vision were not exactly the same as those ordinary examinees. He was more concerned about how to enter the second floor of the academy. The young examinee in front of him should be an ordinary person, so it was very meaningless to argue with him on these things. On the contrary, after hearing the old woman's words, he could not help but secretly admire Ning Ke for getting the answer in such a short time. He earnestly asked, "For the math question, I first used the method of exhaustion, and then came up with an infinite number. Finally, I figured out the reason behind it. I wonder if this is," Situilan whispered Ning Ke's name in his ear. Xie Qingyun nodded to express his gratitude. He looked at Ning Ke and continued to say, "I wonder how Brother Ning calculated it. Did you use some other algorithm to be so fast? If it was an infinite number at a glance, why did I use exhaustion at the beginning? As for the last answer, in fact, I was too lazy to push it to the end, so I just wrote down the number." Ning Ke's answer was very irresponsible, like Mr. Almost Same. But in fact, he was not talking nonsense. The so-called conversion between the concept of infinity and precise values was nothing more than irresponsible ambiguity. Many people did not understand. Some thought that Ning Ke had hit the jackpot, and some thought that Ning Ke was hiding something. Only Xie Qingyun seemed to understand, but when he was about to ask further, the voice of the instructor of the academy called the roll in the distance.